In today's video, we're going to examine how a perfectly competitive firm transitions from the short run to long run equilibrium. I'm going to assume for the moment that the cost analysis chart that you see here is not unfamiliar, that you are comfortable with how all of these numbers can be derived from really the total cost column on its own. If you're still having difficulty with that, I suggest you take a look at one of the other earlier videos to explain how these numbers can be derived. The one number that can't be derived from the total cost is the price. And the price helps us to determine the marginal revenue, the total revenue, and ultimately we're going to combine those with the cost to determine our profit. So the first thing I want to point out is that we can tell with 100% certainty that this is a firm operating under conditions of perfect competition. And the way that we can tell that is that this firm can sell as many goods as it wants, so at any quantity, it can sell each of those goods for $20 a piece. So at a price of $20, this silver mine can sell as many ounces of silver as it would like. That indicates that this is perfect competition, and that's something that we should be aware of and make note of. The AP is fond of asking that type of question. With sufficient understanding and analysis, we can make some predictions on the basis of the information that's presented here and find out what's going to happen in the long run. For example, I can tell immediately that this $20 per unit price is not going to be the price in the long run. That the price is going to have to rise. And I can also point out that this firm is having a hard time operating, that at no point do they have a positive economic profit. That doesn't necessarily indicate that this firm should shut down immediately, however. So those are the kinds of questions that we want to be able to understand and be able to explain as we examine perfect competition in its transition from short-run equilibrium to long-run equilibrium. We're going to use the per unit cost and per unit revenue curves to help in our analysis of the perfectly competitive firm as it transitions to the long-run equilibrium. The first thing I'd like to point out is that this is still our perfectly competitive firm because we've got marginal revenue equals demand equals average revenue equals price, also known as Mr. DARP. We saw that on our previous tables when we saw a constant price that was equal to a constant marginal revenue. That is an indication that this is perfect competition. We are going to then take a look at what this firm should do. It has no power to influence this price. Remember that that price is determined by some larger market, in this case the larger silver market, of which Graybur's silver mine is just one small player. That mine has no ability to change the price of silver. If this mine tries to sell its silver for even 1 penny over $20 per ounce, they won't be able to sell any because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other competitors selling the exact same good at that $20 equilibrium price. So the only real question that the Graber firm has is how many goods to produce. And to examine that, we're going to use the profit maximizing rule of marginal revenue equals marginal cost. This rule is incredibly important to know because it exists in perfect competition and all other market structures as the profit maximizing rule. This is going to help us to figure out how many goods to produce. So here we have our Nike swoosh, the marginal cost curve that begins to increase after diminishing marginal return sets in, and it intersects the marginal revenue curve at this quantity. And we noticed from our chart before that that quantity was quantity 4, where the marginal cost equals 20 and the marginal revenue equals to 20. We don't need to use those numbers, however. We can simply use the intersection of marginal cost equals marginal revenue to figure out that this firm will maximize its profit at this quantity at the intersection of these 2 points. Just to further explain that, if the firm were to exceed quantity 1, or 4 goods at this point, that the marginal cost would be greater than the marginal revenue. In other words, the cost of producing the next good would exceed the amount of money that is received from selling that next good. And if we look back at the chart, this is borne out. The fifth good is going to cost $30 to make, and we're still only going to be able to sell it for $20, which means that the additional revenue from that next good isn't sufficient to cover the cost, which means that we're going to lose an additional $10. And we can see that in the profit column, our loss goes from -$30 to -$40. So that profit maximizing rule is also going to be our loss minimizing rule. So let's use this graph to explain the information that we saw in our chart, namely that this firm can't make enough money to cover its costs. The money that the firm has coming in, that is revenue, can be expressed by price times quantity. We saw this in our chart earlier when 4 goods were produced. The price was 20, so the total revenue was 80. Since we're not using those numbers here, we can still find a different way to do it. We can multiply the quantity here, that profit maximizing quantity, times the price, Mr. Darb, so that the area of this box is going to be equal to our total revenue. We want to compare that total revenue to our total cost. Again, we don't have the numbers, but we can find total cost by simply multiplying average total cost times quantity to find that total cost. So if we take again the same quantity, that profit maximizing quantity, and from that point go to our average total cost curve at that quantity, we can determine that the area of this box, the red box, is equal to our total cost. We can further see that the red box, that is total cost, exceeds our green box, the total revenue. And it exceeds it by this much. This shaded region then represents the loss that this firm is earning. And we saw that on our chart that at quantity 4, our firm was losing $30. That's bad news for this firm, and they might be tempted to shut down immediately. But we know better than that. We know that this firm has to consider its fixed costs at the same time to determine if shutting down is the appropriate strategy. So to determine our fixed costs, we're going to have to look at our average fixed costs. And we can see that can be discovered by taking a look at the difference between the average variable cost and the average total cost at the quantity that we're producing. And we see the vertical length of that line is then equal to the average fixed cost. Much like we have with our average total cost, if we multiply average fixed cost by quantity, we will equal our fixed costs. So this, again, this vertical distance is the average fixed cost. We want to multiply that by this quantity such that the area of this box is now equal to our fixed costs. We saw in our graph that our fixed costs were always equal to $50. And we further saw that our loss when producing the best number of goods we could do was -$30. So if we want to translate those numbers to this graph, this area of loss here is the $30 that this firm would lose on a monthly basis, whereas this area refers to the fixed costs that would be lost on a monthly basis if the firm shut down immediately. So if they continue to produce, they're able to have enough revenue to cut into their fixed costs. They pay all of their variable costs and a portion of their fixed costs, and the remainder is the loss. Because that loss is less than their fixed cost, this firm will want to continue to produce in the short run. While we've established that this firm's loss in the short run is not going to be sufficient to cause it to shut down immediately, it does make sense that in the long run this firm is going to seek a better alternative because they would not like to earn that loss month after month. So as this firm enters the long run, the fixed costs will be considered variable costs because in the long run no costs are fixed, all costs are variable. At that point, this firm will choose to drop out to eliminate this loss. And as it does this, other firms are going to drop out as well that are earning this similar loss. What will happen then is that the industry supply curve is going to have to begin to shift leftward to a new position intersecting the unchanged demand curve at a higher price. What that means is that Mr. DARP is not going to remain the same for the firms that happen to still be in the short run and have those fixed costs. So Mr. DARP is going to begin to rise until this loss is eliminated, and that will stop the procession of firms leaving the industry and stop the supply curve from shifting leftward. That is going to take place when Mr. DARP reaches the long-run equilibrium point, which we're going to see takes place at this minimum of the average total cost curve. So in the long run, price must go through this minimum point of the average total cost curve. If it doesn't, then the firms that are there will either experience a profit or a loss. But if the price goes through that point, we can see that the profit maximizing firm will choose to produce at a different quantity, because now marginal cost intersects marginal revenue at a different quantity. At this quantity, we can determine its revenue and its costs using the same method. The new quantity times the new price is going to be the total revenue, and the new quantity times the new average total cost is going to equal the total cost. And because revenue equals total cost, this firm and firms like it will break even. That is, that they will have zero economic profit. No firms will have an incentive to leave, because zero economic profit means they're doing as well as they could in their next best alternative. And no firms have an incentive to enter, because firms aren't going to be doing any better than their current alternative if they're not already in this market. So this is why the price has to ultimately rest at the minimum of the average total cost curve in the long run. But of course, the firm doesn't get to choose that price. That firm comes from the market, which means that the rise in Mr. DARP has to come about because of the decrease in the supply curve. So this price, this long-term price at the minimum of the average total cost curve, will be seen in the marketplace, but it will be seen as a result of a new supply curve that takes place because firms have left the industry. We see a decrease in the supply curve. The amount of producers in capped G is our reason for that decrease in supply, and firms have left the industry such that we have a new equilibrium price, P2, and a new equilibrium quantity for the market, Q2. It's worth pointing out that the industry is producing less goods, while the firms that remain are actually producing more goods. This seeming contradiction can be explained by the fact that there are simply fewer goods in the market, which explains why the supply curve decreased in the first place. And thus we see a perfectly competitive market and firm in the long-run equilibrium. There are then only 4 possible short-run equilibrium. We've just gone through the first of those possibilities, that the firm is earning a short-run economic loss. This takes place when Mr. DARP falls between the average total cost curve and the average variable cost curve. If the price is between those two cost curves, that indicates that the total cost will be greater than the total revenue, but it also indicates that the loss that ensues will be less than the total fixed costs that the firm would have to pay if they shut down immediately. So, as we've just demonstrated, firms will leave the industry until Mr. DARP rises and intersects the minimum of the average total cost curve in the long run. Let's take a look at some of the other possibilities. Here we have a perfectly competitive firm earning a loss that is sufficient for it to shut down immediately. So this position, when the marginal revenue is at the minimum of the average variable cost, means that the best the firm can do is to produce a quantity of goods such that the total revenue is exceeded by the total costs by an amount that is equal to the both the loss shorthand to the fixed costs. The average total cost to the average variable cost times quantity equals the fixed cost. So the loss is equal to the fixed cost, so this firm would rather shut down than continue to produce in the short run. It's worth noting that as this firm shuts down, supply curve will shift to the left, price will begin to rise until the marginal revenue intersects the marginal cost curve at the minimum of the average total cost, that is, it reaches the long-run equilibrium. Here we have a firm that is earning a short-run economic profit. We can tell that because the marginal revenue exceeds the average total cost curve and therefore is earning a positive economic profit that can be discovered by pointing out that the total revenue exceeds the total cost by an amount that will be equal to this firm's economic profit. This profit, however, will be short-lived because it will serve as a beacon to other entrepreneurs in the industry because there are no barriers to entry. In the perfectly competitive market, more firms will enter, the supply curve will shift to the right until the price falls to the minimum, of that average total cost curve. So that this firm will now break even in the long run. That leads us to our fourth and final position, the long-run equilibrium. Because the price is equal to the marginal cost at the minimum of average total cost, this firm will break even, its total revenue will be equal to its total profit, and there will be no incentive for this firm to leave the industry, nor will there be an incentive for any other firms to join the industry. So we find that it will be the long-run equilibrium price and quantity for this industry. So please review the four possibilities: profit, short-run loss, the shutdown point, and finally our long-run equilibrium. I hope this has helped, and please let me know if you have any questions about this topic during class or at extra help.